And so I thought we could start off by just introducing, we've got two fabulous people here to provide some really great perspectives on legal work that they do. I'll briefly introduce them and then turn it over to them and just talk a little bit about themselves. So directly to my left is Lauren Breda, and she's a graduate of the law school in 2011. And she just finished a 2-year clerkship with the state trial court judge. And so she got to see firsthand in the courtroom sort of the different kinds of representation that people had. And she also got to see what it meant when people didn't have a lawyer and had to appear before a judge asking for assistance. And she's going to be starting next week, working for the New Hampshire Public Defender's Office, which is the office here in New Hampshire that is charged with providing free legal representation for indigent criminal defendants. So, you know, and when this movie took place, we didn't have the decision of Gideon versus Wainwright, which is the Supreme Court saying that in a criminal case, a person is entitled to free counsel if they can't otherwise afford it. And that's sort of how that decision is realized in New Hampshire. And then to my far left is Brian Shaughnessy. He's a partner at a law firm in Manchester, but he also heads up the New Hampshire Bar Association's pro bono board, and he's done a lot of great work, using his time to provide free legal services to people who are in need. So unlike criminal defendants, people who are interfacing with the civil legal justice system, whether they're facing eviction, parental termination, custody, landlord-tenant issues, they're not entitled to any kind of paid counsel, even though the statistics show that they're 5 to 6 times more likely to prevail on their claims if they're represented. So he generously donates his time to provide counsel to those kind of clients. So I'll turn it over to you, and then we can just open it up for questions or discussion as everyone else wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add other than the intros. So if you guys have questions that you want to ask us, or if you have anything else to add.
I'm the president of the pro bono board for the New Hampshire Bar Association. What I think most folks don't understand is that there are many attorneys in New Hampshire that dedicate many, many hours to make sure that low-income folks are represented in the courts. Erin just referenced the Gideon case, and that's an important case for criminal defendants, and that's where the United States Supreme Court established that if the government's going to take away your liberty and your freedoms, that it's a constitutional right to actually have counsel before that takes place. But many times people going before the civil system have a lot of things at stake as well, and they don't have that same constitutional right. When you think about it, people who have their children at stake in an abuse or neglect proceeding, they may lose their parental rights. I mean, that's as precious to anybody as your freedom. The type of work that I do and what I've volunteered a lot of time with is helping people who are facing homelessness, who are being evicted. I kind of have a dual role. I'm known in New Hampshire as the landlord guy. I actually represent a lot of housing authorities, low-income housing providers, and I do a lot of leasing work and eviction work actually for landlords. But since 1994, I've been on the board of directors of a nonprofit in Manchester called The Way Home, and we provide safe, affordable housing for low-income folks. We provide the housing, but not only do we provide housing, we provide them tools and skills to keep the housing. So housing is such a core thing for children. That's what my passion is. My passion is to help people, maintain their rights, maintain access to the courts, and that's a big thing that the pro bono board, and what drew me to the pro bono board, and actually elected me president within the past year. And the reason I agreed to serve is because I do think it's very important that people have respect for the law. I mean, it is a very fundamental part of our government, the respect for the law. People in other countries are just amazed that you have an election and you don't have a riot. I mean, that's respect for the law. And what this movie does for me is it really shows that, the respect for the law. I think one of the moving parts of this, there were several different parts that really tugged at my heartstrings, but when Scout is on the front porch and talking to Atticus, and she's obviously disturbed because her friends are saying, why are you representing him? Why, the town is against this, Atticus. Why are you doing this? Kind of funny to call him Atticus, right? And he says to her, he just says, I couldn't hold my head high. What he didn't say is that it's the right thing to do. I mean, that's just the right thing to do. That's equal access to the courts, and that's justice. And so when you look at, our Constitution, the first line of it is, we the people to establish justice. And at the end of our Pledge of Allegiance, it's equal justice under the law. So that's something that's important to many lawyers, it's important to me, and it really is one of the goals of the Pro Bono Board to bring free legal services to people who truly can't afford it, but they do need equal access to justice. So I think it's a very important and moving film from that perspective. There's many other nice little themes in there as well.
So I'm happy to take questions from the audience if you have questions or want to add something.
What date was the movie? I just can't remember.
And I think it was actually produced in like 1960, but it was
60?
60, but it was about a story that took place in 1934.
Yeah.
So it was during the Depression was when the actual plot took place. But it was actually produced before the I Had a Dream speech, which today is the 50th anniversary. So.
Yeah.
Are there some important Supreme Court decisions that protected defendants from the caste system that we saw in the movie and that still exists today? I mean, it happens all over this country. My background happens to be Alaska. Native Alaskans are persecuted for the same crime at a much greater rate than a white defendant. So are there any specific Supreme Court decisions that have tried to mitigate that caste system and the impact it has?
But I think some of what you'll see in the criminal context is the ability to challenge the jury selection, right? So, I mean, one of the things you'll notice in that particular case was there was 12 white men on that jury. And so if you're entitled to a jury of your peers, that certainly wasn't Tom Robinson's peers. And so the court has come down with the ability to sort of be able to challenge sort of who the jury is, and also the ability to sort of move your case if you think that the jury pool is tainted.
And what case was that? What?
I mean, there's several cases. I don't know a specific
Yeah,
Supreme
no,
Court
any
case.
specific.
A lot of them are, but they basically, it allows for this idea that the jury pool has to truly be comprised of, your peer group.
Was that the case in the Trayvon Martin trial? I don't recall what the jury making was.
They were all white, I think.
No, there was one Hispanic one.
It was
But they're all women.
But they were all.
And a jury of your peers, what's the definition of peers? Because does peer mean your socioeconomic group? Does it mean your race or whatnot? Really what it means is from the community in general. So that's what they consider your peers. And I can't point to any specific case, but there have been many cases that have challenged. For example, if I'm in a trial, whether it's civil or criminal, you have what's called peremptory challenges, and I can, out of a jury of 12, I can have 3 challenges for any reason. I don't like the way they look. They have, an ugly tattoo, or I think that they're too old and my client's young, and I think they'll, hold something against them. So I can just challenge them for any reasons. But there have been cases where they've seen these challenges being used to get all the blacks off the jury or all the Hispanics off the jury. And those cases have gone up, and the Supreme Court says, no, you can't use that. You can't use those peremptory challenges in that way to try to get a biased jury, because the goal is to get an unbiased jury. And, but I can't point to any one particular case. But I think the whole system is geared towards being able to challenge it, as Erin said, being able to challenge something that you see is wrong, and your access to the court system, and to have an attorney help you, go up through the court system to challenge an injustice. I mean, I recently went up to the U.S. Supreme Court on a case that was crazy to get up there. It had to do with a guy who got his car towed out of a parking lot. Okay, his car got towed. It got stolen basically from him by the tow truck driver, who didn't want to give it back to him. He sold it, wanted to give him his money. Stupid little case, right? I mean, and I got up to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and I won it there. And this guy is a low-income, elderly guy. I got associated with him in my landlord-tenant context that, I'm not looking to make a buck like people say, oh, lawyers are out there to make dollars or whatnot. He had his rights trampled upon, and it was very important to him. They're the ones who brought it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I was recently giving a speech before some lawyers, and they wanted me to talk about the experience. And what I said is, the system works. The system works because he had the ability. And we weren't saying, hey, you had to pay this fee to get there, you had to be in a special status. This guy was a low-income, elderly gentleman in Manchester, was able to have the U.S. Supreme Court decide that, yes, you can sue that tow truck driver for stealing your car and not giving you money. So the system works because we have access to the system, and that's why when you hear the pro bono attorneys talk, it's very important to us, access to the system, access to justice. And what we're trying to do is get more money to the civil side of it. We have the Gideon case and cases after that to provide counsel for people who are accused of a crime, but we don't have it so much on the civil side, and it's equally important to protect the rights that way.
Erin, what's the situation with refugees?
So actually, my area of practice is immigration law, and that's another example. So immigration is also considered when it's civil in nature. So it's so the ability for the United States to decide whether or not someone can stay or be sent back to their home country is a civil proceeding, even though deporting someone, particularly a refugee, who might be sent back to persecution or torture, could be tantamount to being incarcerated. You don't have any legal right to counsel in those kind of proceedings. And there's actually been quite a bit of empirical data that's looked at. You're 4 to 6 times more likely to prevail if you have representation before an immigration judge for those proceedings. Now, the refugees that you all are probably familiar with come sort of in a little different of a legal posture. They've actually had their claim adjudicated overseas by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's refugee officers, and they've already been found to meet the legal definition of a refugee, both under international law and U.S. law. And so when they come here, that piece of their case has already been adjudicated. But until they become citizens, they can be removed from this country for committing even minor crimes or infractions, and they don't have any legal right to counsel in those kind of proceedings. And actually, we work. There's actually an immigration clinic at the law school that has a partnership with Catholic Charities that works to provide representation for people. And one of the things that we also work really closely with is the Public Defender's Office, because someone who gets convicted of very minimal crimes, even certain misdemeanors, if they're convicted of that crime, that can make them eligible for deportation. And there's really no ability for a judge to sort of balance the equities in the case. And that's, in those kind of cases, it's really important that you've got attorneys thinking about what are the immigration consequences of a criminal plea or criminal conviction. But if they don't have that representation, they may not know. And there's actually a recent Supreme Court case that came down called Padilla versus Kentucky, which says that defense counsel criminal defense counsel has to at least apprise adequately someone of the immigration consequences of criminal plea, or that can be grounds to bring in effective assistance of counsel. So
That makes me think of the counsel for arraignment, which is, I worked on a project with the law school with 2 other professors to get criminal defendants counsel at their arraignment, which is typically the first time they appear before the court. And they used to not have to have lawyers, and they would show up and they would have to plead guilty or not guilty. Oftentimes they would speak with a prosecutor, and they would have to appear before the judge and not really know what was in store for them, what was going to happen, whether they should plead guilty or not guilty. And so I worked with 2 professors to change that in New Hampshire so that criminal defendants will have counsel at arraignment the first time that they show up at the court. For reasons just like that, where immigrants will show up or not know that they could be deported if they plead guilty to a certain crime, and of having a lawyer there, they now have that knowledge and can think about all the consequences of pleading guilty.
Would you see the prosecution charging us Class Bs then instead of As, so that they would, even at arraignment? Because they wouldn't be entitled to an attorney for Class B.
Right.
Most folks won't know is Class A. You're entitled to counsel if the sentence can put you in jail if your liberty can be taken away. Class A misdemeanor is up to 1 year in jail. Class B is no jail time, so you're not entitled to counsel. So it's a good question about, those folks who are Class B, and that is in the prosecutor's hands as to how it gets charged. B and N run around.
Yeah, and I can't speak to what the prosecutors
Well, how's
do.
the Public Defender's Office going to handle the influx of cases at arraignment?
With the arraignment?
Mm-hmm.
I know that they've worked to organize certain lawyers covering certain days of arraignment. So I know, like in the Manchester District Court, they don't necessarily do arraignments every day. And so they'll send and I know, I think in Laconia too. And so they've come up with a schedule. I'm not quite sure how the system works, but certain lawyers will just go and cover arraignment, and they won't necessarily be that person's lawyer for the rest of their case, but is that they're there to give them advice and to make sure that they have someone there with them, that they have counsel before they plead guilty or not guilty at their arraignment.
Did. There's been a book around this last year called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and I wonder if you're familiar with it and whether you have any comment on it.
What's the sort of basis of it?
Mass incarceration of Black and brown people.
In an age of colorblindness.
In the age of colorblindness, we have more people incarcerated in this country than any other country. And many of the incarcerations are nonviolent crimes, like 60%, and it's destroying people's lives. And it appears that a very significant part of that is prosecutors who don't seem to be accountable. And where I live, prosecutors probably have millions of dollars to prosecute cases. Public defenders have about 500,000, and I wonder if that's the same here in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, generally speaking, what's nice about the New Hampshire Public Defender's Office as opposed to some public defender's offices, my understanding is that their budget is actually separate from the general budget that's approved by the legislature. So they're in some ways are shielded from a lot of drastic cuts or across the board cuts. I think there's still a differential between sort of what the AG's office has and what the New Hampshire Public Defender's Office has, but I don't think it's as stark as it is in some other states.
And I think that New Hampshire is a very fortunate place for criminal defendants to live. The Public Defender's Office, although they don't necessarily have all of the resources that the attorneys do, most of the time if they do make requests for more funds to, say, a further investigation or competency evaluation, I mean, they have to do that. But, you know, if they request more funds, it's usually granted, you know, to the extent that it can be.
Well, they can get funds for private investigations and, expert witnesses and things like that. And New Hampshire, such a small state, it's a different bar than probably most other states. I'm not that old, I'm only 50. And when I started out in 1980, I was in law school in 86, 87. A second-year law student, I was actually trying cases because we didn't have, we had a public defender's office, but we didn't have contract attorneys that we have now. And we would get appointed by the judge. The district court judge would call up the law office and say, hey, I need somebody to represent so-and-so because the public defender's office has a thing. Much like you saw at the beginning of this show. You saw that, Atticus Finch was visited by the judge and says, I need you to represent this gentleman. And he said yes. I mean, that's the way New Hampshire was, less than 30 years ago. We had that type of situation where the judges would be looking out and want somebody to be represented, and they would have private attorneys, who weren't being paid, who were basically, appointed by the courts. We still have that to a certain extent with some of the contract attorneys or private attorneys who get that do contract work where the public defender either has conflict or whatnot. So New Hampshire's always had a unique way of making sure the need is filled, and I don't think we see it's not such the cattle call that you see in some of the bigger cities and bigger jurisdictions. Manchester is probably the busiest court for criminal work, and it's still manageable. I'm sure the public defenders are overworked, but so is the Hampshire Legal Aid, so are the pro bono people. But we seem to make it work, and the judges here help out in that regard.
And when there is a criminal defendant that shows up that comes to court without counsel and tells the judge that he or she would prefer not to have counsel, the judge typically goes through a very long, spiel about how I can appoint you an attorney if you want another one or whatever it is. If you don't like the one that you have, they always try to work it out so that the person who is indigent does get counsel, and they always advise them against going forward without
I've seen it happen many times as I'm sitting in the court, and, you know, the person's, no, I just wanted this judge, and the judge says, no, I'm not gonna take your plea. Sorry, no, I'm just not gonna accept the plea, I'm not taking a guilty plea, come back another day, we're gonna give you a trial date, go talk to an attorney if you don't want, all right, we'll have a trial. They won't even let them, you know, plead guilty because they know that they need counsel.
Because a lot of people don't realize what the word felony means for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And they
Well, and a lot of people, either they're incarcerated and they just want to get out, they'll do anything to get out, or they'll say anything at that time, and I've seen the judges time and again, they advise them their rights, and they make sure that they're not being stupid.
What about the issue of timely justice? In the movie, I got the feeling that from the time that Tom Robinson was arrested to the time it went to trial, there was a long delay. And certainly from reading the newspapers in this day and age, there's no such thing as timely justice anymore, it feels to me like. I mean, cases drag on for years, and people are given credit for 3 years' time spent incarcerated prior to a hearing or a trial. So what protects people that who are defendants, that are incarcerated, from this what appears to be an incredibly long delay? Maybe it isn't, maybe it just strikes me down.
I can take that, but if you've done the public defender, you know the time frame, so
Yeah,
pretty strict in New Hampshire.
I don't know the exact time frame. I haven't started quite yet at the public defender's office, but I was going to say just that the criminal defendants obviously have their right to a speedy trial, and the defense attorneys are allowed to raise that, but oftentimes the lawyers will come to an agreement and the defendant will agree as well. If they need to do more investigation, more discovery, and with the bigger cases, especially murders, felonious sexual assaults, things that are serious, they take more time to dig up the facts, essentially.
Those are from the defendant's side. The defendant is the one that's wanting more time,
Right.
because if they don't get a trial within a certain period of time, especially if they're incarcerated, they're guaranteed to get out. They have to let them out. I think it's a 90-day period that they actually have to have a pretrial conference or something. But if I am defending a criminal defendant and I ask for a continuance, I have to assure the judge that my client is waiving his right to speedy trial and whatnot. So many of those delays are on the defense side, because you need more time to investigate things. Unusual if they're incarcerated, that would be delayed for no reason though. And actually, in New Hampshire, one of the problems, I'm a civil attorney, I do more civil work, and we get pushed back. It's the not access to having the civil jury trials. That's the one that suffered. We got much better a couple of years ago. About 6 years ago, we were waiting for 3 to 4 years because I'd have a jury trial scheduled for next week, and they can't even give me the day because they don't know how many criminal trials are going forward. They take priority on the docket, and you only have so many jury members and so many courtrooms that have juries. So you could have 2 criminal trials now, and the only 2 courtrooms that are available in Merrimack County, for example, in Concord. Well, there are no civil cases that week. It's all jury. But a lot of criminal trials that then plead out at the last minute. So it's a juggling act. But absolutely, criminal trials get priority.
This is Mr. Shaughnessy. I practice up in Sullivan County, and we're one of our judges is starting to reappoint on abuse and neglect cases. Do you see any movement from the legislature to change back to the appointing, or any movement in the area of the county that you practice, or the area of the state that you practice, whether judges are doing the same or moving the other way?
I don't practice in that area, so I can't speak to what Hillsborough is doing. But in my capacity as president of Pro Bono, I'm also have been a participant in Access to Justice, and I know there's a lobbying effort going on to try to change that. The problem we have, as you know, in New Hampshire is the legislature, when they cut, they don't, that's a great place to cut. They've been cutting the judiciary time and time again in the last several years. There have been battles between the legislature, and we thought for a time it was just Chief Justice Brock, but that wasn't it. It's just the legislature, we're going to cut the judiciary. So I can't say that I've seen, because I don't practice, I don't know what the judges are doing in Hillsborough County. I just know there is a concerted effort to try to get that back on the table. Pro Bono's been hit by that because what they're trying to do is get more pro bono attorneys in to do those types of cases. And those are very complex, immediate, and there are only few people who actually know how to do it. We only have, limited numbers of people that we can actually appoint. And now we're saying, hold it, you know, you can't dump this on the pro bono, you know, shoulders. We're still doing the marital stuff, which is a mess. You know, there's so many marital people that the people in divorces that don't have an attorney. When you get in there, what's unique about New Hampshire and the pro bono, there's other states, their pro bono program isn't as intensive. They don't have an attorney that actually takes over a case. They have referral services. They have, but in New Hampshire, we have attorneys actually get appointed, and they go soup to nuts. Well, in a marital case, it can take 2 to 3 years. And when somebody is a free attorney, and they're paying for it, hey, let's go to war, you know, you got to rein those things in. So I really can't speak to the core of your question, but I can say there's a lot of activity trying to get that funding back on the table. Because as I said at the outset, I think that's just as important as being incarcerated, having your child taken away, and you don't have an attorney. When the state has all the resources available to it, take your child away, and I think that's an abomination. So.
And I just one thing to add on it too is that one of the things that the Access to Justice Commission is trying to also show is sort of how it's much more cost effective to actually have people represented on the front end, right? So we had an economic assessment that was done. We did a study that looked at sort of the legal needs in New Hampshire, who needs legal assistance, who needs representation. And then we looked at sort of the economic impact, both sort of the direct economic impact of people who are experiencing things like victims of domestic violence who aren't going to work, so they're not actually participating in the economy, then also just how without representation, their cases, you know, talk about dragging out the system, right? A judge is going to want to adjourn that case so they can get that person an attorney. Then the judge ends up having to advise that person on sort of their rights, and it just produces a much longer, and it's much more costly to the courts. And then if they end up getting representation on the back end, they may want to appeal because they didn't have representation. And so getting people that representation right away is actually a cost-saving measure. You know, that's one of the arguments, and I think there's a lot of data that lays that out. But you're gonna.
Well, also, what protects a defendant from substandard pro bono public defender work? How can a defendant protect him or herself if their court assigns a lawyer who, A, could care less what happens, B, doesn't have the expertise, C, doesn't have the time, whatever, you know? What are the precedents that you can draw on to protect yourself from that?
After the fact, defendants can always file, in an appeal or what we call a habeas corpus, and they can claim that their counsel was ineffective. And the name of the case escaped me, the U.S. Supreme Court case. Ineffective assistance, the first one, or the big one.
Yeah.
Strickland.
Strickland
versus Washington lays out a whole list of factors that the judge will go through, and in that process, the defendant might be entitled to another attorney, and he can have an entire hearing about how his trial counsel may or may not have been providing ineffective assistance of counsel. And lawyers all are bound by professional conduct rules and could be in violation of those rules if they decide to show up and not do anything for.
It's a constant challenge for us at the Pro Bono Board. I do a lot of screening for the landlord-tenant cases, and I do a lot of mentoring because I'm the landlord-tenant guru in New Hampshire. I field questions from private attorneys, call me up on a weekly basis, but I serve as a mentor. We have several mentors in our program that sit on our board in marital and in different areas, so we kind of self-police the pro bono attorneys, and my executive director is pretty attuned to that. She knows the attorneys who we're not referring people to because they may not be as sharp as other attorneys in that area, and we try to place them in areas of expertise because, as pointed out, it's unethical for an attorney to actually take on a case to say, oh, I'd like to take that. I'll learn as I go. No, you can't do that. That's unethical because if it's beyond your professional expertise. It doesn't mean you can't learn, but you have to put the time in to learn it in order to fulfill your ethical duties to the client. And you can get in trouble in the bar if you don't do that.
Additionally, too, at the public defender's office, before they even let attorneys take their own cases, they have to go through a whole month of training. It's very rigorous, as I've heard.
They got a fabulous training program there, and they have seasoned attorneys who've been there forever. They got very good trial training at the public defender's office.
noticed in the play that the Attorney General, or the attorney for the prosecution, did not give his final conclusion. I don't know whether that was to shorten the film or some poetic justice of some kind, but it just occurs to me, or to ask the question, I should say, if he doesn't present his side of the total review of the trial as it's been presented, is that in some way say, hey, jury, we won. I don't have to say anymore. Is there some way that he has to give that, or can he just say, I have nothing to say?
It's not mandatory.
The summation of the trial.
Well, and also, technically, it's not supposed to be considered as evidence either. So when the jury is actually deliberating what's said in the closing arguments, aren't supposed to be the basis of the conclusions that the jury arrives at. Now, obviously, they potentially could have persuasive impact, but the jury is instructed that they're not supposed to use the closing summation as the basis for how they arrive at their conclusion.
To answer your question, it's not mandatory. I just can't imagine an advocate not wanting to give a closing argument, because you're going to summarize all the different evidence and then try to incorporate what was missing from there too. At the end of the evidence, the judge will give the jury instructions. It's called jury charge, and he'll charge, all right, this is what the charge is, these are the elements, and it's really like a half an hour at least for a jury to be charged. So that was missing. And they did a lot of things just to move things along. So for example, when Atticus Finch says, catch this glass, and he goes, that was inappropriate. That's not even evidence. He wasn't even sworn in. He shouldn't even have talked. So that was just all, to move the story along. It really wasn't the way it would happen in court. You see that all the time in shows. My wife drives me crazy there, and I said, they don't do that. You see the people having depositions in these TV shows, and people are arguing. That doesn't happen. You can't do that.
I'm impressed with all three of you have presented the legal profession as having apparently a lot more members of the profession who have human feeling and a real sense of social justice. I'm realizing it more as I'm listening to you. From my own standpoint, my own, I'm a physician, and it's part of our tradition that it becomes a part of us, a lot of us that we do have, or it brings out some tools that we can use to express our own human feelings and the warmth for humanity. I just haven't heard this much. I hadn't realized there was a pro bono system in the state regarding law, and I hadn't realized that our own University of New Hampshire Law School apparently takes this very seriously.
Well, they're wonderful. I mean, they've had clinics where they train. They're very dedicated to training the law students to get out into the field. They have clinical experience, and they're they push the pro bono service and whatnot. And I think what a lot of people don't realize about attorneys, we get the rap of, we're money hungry and we don't care and it's all about business and whatnot. And I'm sure that's true with any part of anybody's profession. But from my own experience, the number one, New Hampshire is a little different than other states, but I think by and large the attorneys I know have all volunteered their time for nonprofit organizations, on boards, many boards, different boards. I'm on three boards now, president of two, vice president of the other, so I dedicate a lot of time towards, and then I'm the town moderator of the town of Bedford, so again, that's given to the community. So I think a lot of attorneys in New Hampshire dedicate a lot of time to making sure the communities work, and again, the pro bono program, just making sure that people have So there's a lot of compassionate attorneys out there. We have our boneheads too. That's for
Yeah,
sure.
well, in medicine, we have our boneheads too. And I would also,
Try not to let them talk too much.
I would also commend you for not lapsing into legalese type talk tonight. That can become a crutch. I suspect it is in your profession as in for mine, as it can be in mine, is to snow people and leave people kind of wondering what's really been said. But you have spoken, I think, in using language that all of us can relate to.
I think that's the new generation. I went to BU and I graduated in '89, and my writing teacher said, "Speak plain English." You look at some of these historical documents with the aforesays and this and that. It's like, no one talks that way. Why are you writing that way? So I get slapped across the knuckles and trying to pass in there, trying to use all these big words that So we try to speak plain English. I think
I was
nowadays.
thrilled in candidates.
Yeah, I graduated from BC in '97, and we actually had a textbook that was plain English for lawyers in our writing class. So.
I would say, before I came to New Hampshire, one of my previous jobs was I actually ran a pro bono program at a nonprofit organization in Washington, D.C., and I can say that all of the major law firms sent their attorneys to our organization to do pro bono cases. And I think in my experience, when I would go and sort of recruit young lawyers and older lawyers to take these cases, it was some of the most meaningful work they did. So it really gave them a sense of value for their law degree and a sense of giving back. And I think once people actually expose themselves, it's infectious, right? I mean, you just can't do one case. And so I think there is lawyers give a bad reputation, but I think most lawyers that I've come across take their professional credentials very seriously and recognize that they have an ability to navigate a really complicated system in a way that a layperson doesn't. And because they have this ability and this skill set, they have an obligation and a responsibility to give back to the people who don't have the ability to pay for that service. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we're at 9:30. Just in summation, anybody want to say anything? This is a Thinking for the Future series. Anybody want to say anything about what you see happening for the future in New Hampshire or the future of your particular organization or department?
I think one of the things that I work on in the work that I do with young lawyers is to sort of inspire them to do what Atticus Finch did, which is to take on the unpopular case, even if you may lose, and that there's something of value in having, when you think about that room, right, unfortunately that man was murdered, but when you look at the balcony and the people that stood up as Atticus Finch walked out, he gave all of those people up there a sense that there was something more fair in the justice system before he walked in that courtroom than when he left that courtroom. And that's something that I hope that we can continue to train our future lawyers to embrace.
I agree, and I think that most of the cases that the public defender's office takes are the unpopular cases, but the justice system, I think in New Hampshire and in other places as well, is constantly changing, constantly, moving back and forth. But I think that the most important part is that everybody's in it together, and I think that people might have public defenders might get a bad rap, or people might look at them differently than other lawyers, but without them the system wouldn't work, and I think that it all works together, and I do think that everybody's on, the jury, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the judge, everybody's trying to find the justice in a system where sometimes there isn't any. But.
So what's the saying? The first thing you do is kill all the lawyers.
Right.
That's what they say, but the whole story of that, the first thing you do is when you want to overthrow a system and overthrow a government and have anarchy and chaos, is the first thing you do is kill all the lawyers. And what I want to see happen, and I love New Hampshire, I love the way we have our legislature, the citizen legislature and whatnot, but what our legislature doesn't understand is that the judiciary is an equal branch of the government, and they too often look towards cutting towards the judiciary And what they don't understand is the ripple effects that it does have, not only on the criminal side, we see the criminal side, but it's really on the civil side and access to justice. So when we're cutting the number of judges who can actually hear cases, well, what happens? The ripple effect is, because the criminal defendant has a constitutional right to a speedy trial, it's the people on the civil side. It's the divorce cases that are very volatile, that can't get heard. An emergency hearing takes 90 days. You know, how many murders take place in a domestic setting? I mean, this is just, it becomes intolerable when you have those types of delays when people don't have access to justice. So what I'd like to see come forward is that the legislature finally gets it, that it is an important part of our government, it is an equal part of the government, and that's not the first place to cut the budget.
Well, thank you.